She had a Winchester, a starving daughter, and 30 days before a corrupt banker took everything her husband died to build. He had $5 million sewn into the bottom of a bag, and enough enemies to get himself thrown off a moving train and left for dead in the desert. When he crawled, broken and bleeding, to the gate of the one woman his empire was destroying, she gave him her last piece of cornbread. She didn't know who he was. And when she found out, she pointed her rifle straight at his chest. Because Clara Vance had survived the West on nothing but pride and grit, and she wasn't about to be saved by the man who was burying her. What this story quietly teaches us is this: real wealth isn't what you own. It's what you're willing to kneel down in the dirt and surrender for. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. If that moved something in you, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Thank you for being part of our community.
The Wyoming sun didn't just shine. It punished. It baked the alkali dust of the Vance Ranch into a cracked white mosaic and turned the air inside the small farmhouse into a suffocating furnace. Clara Vance stood on her front porch, her hands folded tightly within the faded folds of her apron. She kept her spine entirely straight, refusing to offer the man before her the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Thwack! 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 Silas Thorne drove the final iron nail into the doorframe with deliberate theatrical force. He stepped back, the heavy head of the hammer swinging casually at his side, and tipped his bowler hat back from a forehead slick with sweat. He didn't look like a man of the West. He looked like a predator in a tailored vest, imported straight from an East Coast counting room. 30 days, Mrs. Vance, Silas said, his voice a slick drawl that made Clara's skin crawl. That's what the Eastern boys demand. You've missed 3 payments on the principal. The Sterling Bank is calling in the debt. Clara looked at the heavy parchment nailed to her home. The bold black lettering at the top read, Notice of Foreclosure. My husband paid the principal, Silas, Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, icy register. He paid it 2 years ago after the cattle drive. You and I both know the ledger was clear before he died. Paper says different, Clara. Silas smiled, his eyes dragging down the length of her simple cotton dress in a way that made her want to reach for the Winchester just inside the door. And paper is the only law that matters anymore. 30 days, or the sheriff comes to throw your belongings on the road. He didn't wait for an answer. Silas turned, mounted his slick black gelding, and spurred the horse down the wagon trail, leaving a plume of choking dust in his wake. Clara stood perfectly still until the sound of hooves faded into the drone of the cicadas. Then she reached up, grasped the corner of the thick parchment, and ripped it from the nail with one vicious tear. She turned on her heel and walked back into the sweltering kitchen. She opened the heavy iron door of the cook stove. The embers from breakfast were still glowing a dull, angry red. Without a second thought, she tossed the legal document inside. Mama? Clara paused, closing the stove door just halfway. She turned to see her 14-year-old daughter, Lily, standing in the doorway to the back room. The girl held a patched quilt to her chest, her dark eyes wide and watchful. She had her father's eyes, but she had Clara's hardened jaw. Was that Mr. Thorne? Lily asked softly. It was, Clara said, moving to the wooden wash basin to scrub the feeling of Silas's presence from her skin. Is he taking the house? No one is taking this house, Lily. I won't allow it. Clara dried her hands, forcing a steadiness into her tone that she didn't quite feel in her marrow. She walked over to the small wire mesh pantry. Inside, resting on a chipped ceramic plate, was a single hardened square of cornbread. It was the absolute last of their food. The flour barrel was scraped to the splinters and the chickens had stopped laying in the heat. We'll split this for supper, Clara said, trying to offer a reassuring smile. Tomorrow I'll ride out to the Twyver place and see if they have any extra beans to spare for some mending." Lily nodded, but her gaze suddenly snapped past Clara out the open front window. "Mama, someone's on the road." Clara immediately reached behind the door, her hand wrapping securely around the smooth walnut stock of her Winchester. She stepped onto the porch, raising the rifle just a fraction. Out here, unexpected company usually meant trouble, but the figure moving up their long dirt drive wasn't riding. He was barely even walking. It was a man, staggering blindly through the heat haze. He was coated in a thick layer of gray dust, his clothes torn to absolute ribbons. He had no hat, no coat, and no boots, only bloodied, wrapped rags around his feet. As Clara watched, his knees finally gave out. He collapsed hard into the dirt, right at the edge of her property line, and did not move. "Stay inside, Lily," Clara commanded. She stepped off the porch, the rifle held at the ready, her boots crunching on the dry earth as she closed the distance. When she reached the man, she used the barrel of the rifle to gently nudge his shoulder. He groaned, a dry, rattling sound, and rolled onto his back. Clara drew a sharp breath. The man's face was a canvas of fresh brutality. One eye was swollen completely shut, his lips split and caked with dried blood. A massive, dark purple bruise spread across his jaw, and a jagged graze, looking terrifyingly like a bullet wound, tore across his collarbone, exposed by his shredded linen shirt. Someone hadn't just beaten this man. They had tried to execute him. His one good eye fluttered open. It was a piercing, startling shade of pale gray. He looked up at Clara, at the rifle, and then at the sky, his cracked lips moving soundlessly. "Water," he finally rasped, the word tearing at his throat. Clara hesitated. He was a stranger, a drifter, and bringing a desperate man into a house with no man to defend it was a fool's gamble. But as she looked at his blistered, bleeding hands clutching the dirt, the hard shell around her heart cracked just a fraction. "Lily," Clara called out over her shoulder, lowering the rifle. "Bring the water dipper, and the plate from the pantry." Lily appeared on the porch a moment later, holding the tin dipper and the ceramic plate with the single piece of cornbread. She stopped at the edge of the steps, her brow furrowed. "Mama, that's all we have." "I know," Clara said quietly. She took the water and the plate. "But we have a roof to shade us. He has nothing. If we let him die at our gate, we're no better than the men trying to run us out." Clara knelt in the dirt, her dress soaking up the dust. She lifted the man's heavy head, supporting his neck, and brought the tin dipper to his lips. He drank greedily, coughing as the water hit his parched throat. "Slow down," she murmured, her voice losing its edge. "Just slow down." When he had drained the dipper, she broke the hard square of cornbread in two. She pressed the pieces into his trembling, filthy palm, closing his fingers around them. "Eat," she instructed. "Then you can rest in the barn shade." Harrison Sterling, billionaire, railroad magnate, and a man who had dined with presidents, stared at the crumbled dry bread in his hand. 2 days ago, he had been sipping imported brandy in a private rail car. Then came the ambush, the guns in the dark, the brutal beating, and being thrown from a moving train into the unforgiving desert to die. He had learned more about the world in the last 48 hours of agonizing thirst than he had in 38 years of wealth. And right now, the dusty crust of bread pressed into his hand by a widow with a rifle was the most valuable thing he had ever possessed. He forced himself to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest. He took a bite, the dry crumbs catching in his throat, and looked past the woman to the open door of the farmhouse. Through the doorway, he could see the kitchen. The heavy iron door of the cook stove was still propped halfway open. Inside, a thick piece of official parchment was resting on the red-hot coals. The edges of the paper were curling, catching fire, turning black and brittle. But the center of the document was still intact. Harry stopped chewing. His pale gray eye narrowed, locking onto the bottom of the burning page. The bold, sweeping ink was illuminated by the glow of the embers. He saw the word, foreclosure. He saw the seal of the Sterling Bank, and there, burning away in the ashes of a starving widow's stove, he saw the signature authorizing the destruction of her life. It was a perfect forgery of his own name. Harrison Sterling. The piece of cornbread suddenly felt like lead in his stomach. He looked back up at Clara Vance, at her proud, tired eyes, and realized with a sickening jolt that the empire he built was the very thing trying to destroy the woman who had just saved his life. The dry crumbs of the cornbread felt like gravel, but Harrison Sterling swallowed them down like fine caviar. His pale gray eyes remained fixed on the glowing embers of the stove inside the house, where the forged signature of his own name had just curled into ash. He didn't know who this Silas Thorne was, or how deep the rot went within his own Wyoming bank branches, but he knew two things with absolute certainty. He was supposed to be dead on the desert floor, and the empire he had built with his bare hands was currently bleeding this widow dry. Harry gripped the edge of the porch, his muscles screaming in protest as he forced himself to stand. His ribs felt as though they had been struck by a locomotive, and the world tilted violently for a moment before snapping back into focus. Clara Vance stepped out of the doorway, her Winchester still resting casually but deliberately in the crook of her arm. She watched him sway, her dark eyes calculating. "You look like a stiff breeze would put you in the ground," Clara said, her voice flat. "The barn is out back. There's fresh hay. You can rest until tomorrow, then move on." "I owe you for the meal, ma'am," Harry rasped. His throat was so raw his voice sounded like grinding stones. "I don't take charity." Clara arched a delicate, skeptical eyebrow. "You're in no condition to work." "I can work." Harry locked his gaze with hers. It was the same unyielding stare that had broken striking rail workers and intimidated Wall Street tycoons, though right now, coming from a battered man in bloody rags, it was a ridiculous display of pride. Clara studied him for a long, quiet moment. She didn't pity him. She didn't seem to have the luxury of pity left in her, but she recognized the stubborn jut of his jaw. "The western corral fence," she finally said, nodding toward the weathered wooden enclosure about 50 yards from the house. "3 posts are rotted through. The post hole digger and the maul are leaning against the barn door. You reset those posts, we're even." Harry gave a stiff nod. He limped toward the barn, every step sending a fresh wave of agony up his spine. By mid-afternoon, the Wyoming sun was a physical weight pressing down on the valley. Harry stood in the dirt, driving the heavy iron jaws of the post-hole digger into the baked, unyielding earth. He had fenced in polo ponies at his East Coast estate, but he had paid men to do the labor while he drank scotch on a shaded veranda. Now, his bare, blistered palms were slick with his own blood. Sitting on the shaded porch with a basket of mending in her lap, Clara watched him. She hadn't expected him to last an hour, but as the afternoon wore on, the stranger didn't quit. He didn't work with the steady, practiced rhythm of a ranch hand, though. He swung the heavy maul with raw, furious willpower. Clara narrowed her eyes, catching a glint of sunlight off his hands as he wiped sweat from his brow. She set her mending down. The man was covered in dirt, but the structure of his hands was entirely wrong for a drifter. His fingers were long and elegant, and despite the fresh, bleeding blisters bursting across his palms, there were no old, hardened calluses beneath them. His nails, though caked in dark mud, were evenly filed. "Who are you?" she thought, a prickle of unease working its way up her spine. The low, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves broke her concentration. Clara stood up immediately, her hand dropping instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. 2 riders were coming up the dusty wagon trail. Even from a distance, she recognized the slumped, arrogant posture of Bates, one of Silas Thorne's hired enforcers, and a younger cowboy riding beside him. They didn't stop at the porch. They rode their horses straight toward the western corral, right up to the fence line where Harry was working. "Well now, look at this," Bates sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt just inches from Harry's boots. The widow hired herself a scarecrow. Harry didn't respond. He simply leaned his weight against the wooden handle of the post-hole digger, his chest heaving, his pale eyes entirely unreadable. "Thorne says she's got 30 days, the younger cowboy laughed, leaning over his saddle horn. "But them cattle in the back pasture are looking mighty thin. Figure we might do her a favor and herd a few of 'em off to town today. Cover some of that interest." Clara stepped off the porch, her blood running cold, her grip tightening on the Winchester. If they took her breeding cows, she wouldn't survive the winter, foreclosure or not. Bates spurred his horse forward, intending to unlatch the corral gate to access the back pasture. Harry stepped directly into the path of the 1,000-pound animal. "Move out of the way, trash," Bates snarled, raising his heavy leather riding crop. He swung it down viciously, aiming straight for Harry's already battered face. What happened next was so fast, Clara barely registered the movement. Harry didn't flinch. He didn't cower. As the crop came down, he stepped into the blow, letting the leather glance off his shoulder. In the same fluid, blindingly fast motion, his bloody hands shot up, grabbing Bates by the leather vest and the heavy silver belt buckle. Using the horse's own forward momentum and a brutal pivot of his hips, Harry hauled the enforcer completely out of the saddle. Bates hit the hard earth with a sickening crack. Before the dust could even billow, Harry dropped his knee directly onto Bates's windpipe, pinning the much larger man to the dirt. With a practiced flick of his wrist, Harry unholstered the Colt revolver from Bates's hip, cocked the hammer, and pressed the cold steel barrel tight under the cowboy's jaw. The younger cowboy on the second horse panicked, his hand dropping to his own gun belt. Click-clack. The sharp metallic sound of a lever-action Winchester chambering a round echoed across the yard. "Take your hand off that iron, boy," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. She was standing 10 feet away, the rifle pressed tight to her shoulder, the sights lined up perfectly with the center of the young cowboy's chest. "Or I'll drop you where you sit." The cowboy froze, his hands slowly rising in the air. On the ground, Bates was gagging, his eyes wide with genuine terror as he stared up at the bloodied, battered stranger pinning him down. Harry's face was a mask of cold, calculating violence. There was no hesitation in his pale eyes. He looked perfectly willing to pull the trigger. "Tell Thorne," Harry whispered, his gravelly voice dropping so low only Bates and Clara could hear it, "that the cattle stay. And if you ride onto this property again, I won't just take your gun." Harry slowly stood up, stepping off the man's throat. He backed away, keeping the Colt leveled. Bates scrambled to his feet, coughing violently and backing toward his horse. He didn't say a word. He grabbed the reins, hauled himself into the saddle, and spurred the animal hard, galloping back down the road toward town with the younger cowboy trailing frantically behind. The silence that fell over the ranch was heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass. Harry stood frozen for a moment. Then the adrenaline broke. He let out a sharp, ragged breath, his knees buckling slightly, as he clutched his cracked ribs with his free hand. He turned to Clara, offering the stolen Colt revolver, handle first. Clara didn't lower her rifle immediately. She stared at the man standing before her. A drifter who could take down a seasoned, armed enforcer in 3 seconds flat, using nothing but leverage and lethal intent. A man with bleeding velvet hands and the eyes of an apex predator. He was, without question, the most dangerous thing on her property. Slowly, Clara lowered the Winchester and took the revolver from his bloody palm. And heaven help her, as she looked at him, she realized she had never felt safer in her entire life. The Wyoming sky didn't offer warnings. It offered ultimatums. By dusk, the suffocating heat of the afternoon had curdled into something heavy and electric. The horizon turned a bruised, violent shade of purple, and the wind began to howl, kicking up blinding clouds of alkali dust. Inside the farmhouse, Clara was lighting the kerosene lamp when the first crack of thunder hit. It sounded like a cannon shot, rattling the window panes in their frames. "Lily," Clara said sharply, raising her voice over the sudden deafening roar of rain hitting the tin roof. "Check the latches on the back windows. Stay in the center room." "The horses, Mama," Lily yelled back, pointing toward the yard. Clara looked out the front window. Through the sheets of driving, silver rain, she could see the heavy wooden doors of the barn swinging wildly in the gale. If the wind caught them wrong, it would tear the hinges clean off and the terrified horses would bolt into the open prairie, where they would scatter and freeze. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw an oilskin slicker over her shoulders and shoved the front door open, stepping out into the deluge. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Mud instantly sucked at her boots as she fought her way across the yard. The rain was freezing, blinding her as she stumbled toward the barn. She expected to find the drifter huddled in a corner seeking shelter. Instead, as a flash of lightning split the sky, she saw him right in the thick of it. Harry was knee-deep in the muck of the corral, his ruined boots slipping in the mud. He had his arms wrapped tightly around the neck of her panicked roan gelding, using his entire body weight to drag the massive, thrashing animal away from the broken fence and toward the safety of the stalls. "Hold him!" Clara screamed over the thunder, rushing forward to grab the lead rope. Harry didn't look back. His muscles strained, the tendons in his neck standing out in sharp relief as the horse reared, its hooves slicing the air just inches from his head. He didn't let go. He clamped his jaw, fighting through the agonizing pain of his cracked ribs, and hauled the animal inside. Together they wrangled the rest of the stock into the stalls. Clara threw her weight against the heavy barn doors, the wind screaming in protest, while Harry dropped the thick iron crossbar into place, sealing them in relative darkness. They stood there for a moment in the smell of wet hay and horse sweat, chests heaving, chests rising and falling in perfect unison. "We can't stay out here," Clara panted, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. "The roof is leaking over the loft. Come inside." Harry nodded, too exhausted to argue. They made a mad dash back across the yard, bursting through the back door of the farmhouse and into the warmth of the kitchen. Clara slammed the door shut against the storm, leaning her back against the wood and sliding the bolt home. The sudden quiet of the house was jarring. The fire in the hearth was roaring. Lily had done her job well before retreating to her bedroom. "Lily?" Clara called out. "I'm in here, Mama." The girl's voice came from behind the closed bedroom door. "I'm okay." "Stay in bed. The storm will pass," Clara called back. She turned her attention to the man standing dripping on her braided rug. Harry was shivering violently. The rain had washed away the layers of dust, revealing the terrifying extent of his bruising. His shredded linen shirt was plastered to his skin, soaked in a mixture of rainwater, mud, and fresh blood seeping from the cuts on his shoulders and ribs. He looked as though he had been put through a meat grinder, yet he stood straight, his pale gray eyes watching her with a quiet, intense focus. "Take it off," Clara said. Harry blinked. "Ma'am?" "I said take it off. You're bleeding on my rug. And if you catch pneumonia, I don't have the medicine or the time to nurse you," Clara said, her tone entirely practical. She walked to the wash basin, pouring clean water from a pitcher and grabbing a bottle of iodine and a clean rag. "Sit by the fire." Harry hesitated, his jaw tightening, but the cold was seeping into his bones. He moved to the wooden chair by the hearth. With shaking, bloodied hands, he managed to unbutton the remnants of his shirt, peeling the ruined fabric off his shoulders and letting it drop to the floor. Clara walked over, the rag in hand, and stopped dead in her tracks. The firelight cast a warm, golden glow across his torso, throwing his injuries into stark relief. The left side of his ribcage was a horrifying canvas of black and purple. But that wasn't what made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It was his skin. Despite the dirt and the fresh violence, his chest and shoulders were smooth and unblemished by the sun. He didn't have the leathery, deeply tanned neck and arms of a cowboy or a laborer. He had the physique of a man who ate very well, who perhaps fenced or boxed for sport in expensive indoor gymnasiums, completely shielded from the harsh Western elements. And then there was the wound on his collarbone. It wasn't a scrape from a fall. It was a deep, angry groove carved perfectly across the flesh. The edges were seared. "That is a bullet graze," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on the lethal mark. "Somebody shot at you." Harry looked away, staring into the flames. "Must have caught a stray on the road." "Don't lie to me in my own house," Clara said fiercely. "A stray doesn't leave a burn mark like that. Someone put a gun to your chest and pulled the trigger. Who are you running from?" "I'm not running, Clara," Harry said. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it, spoken in that low, gravelly rasp, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked up at her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "And I didn't bring any trouble to your door. The trouble was already here." Clara stared at him. She wanted to demand answers, to point her Winchester at him and force him to explain the velvet hands, the bullet wound, and the lethal fighting skills. Instead, she knelt beside his chair. "This is going to sting," she murmured. She pressed the iodine-soaked rag to the bullet graze. Harry inhaled sharply through his teeth, his muscles going completely rigid, but he didn't pull away. Clara worked quickly but gently, cleaning the wound, her calloused, capable fingers brushing against his hot skin. As she leaned in to wrap a clean bandage around his shoulder, the proximity became suffocating. She could smell the rain on his skin, beneath the copper tang of blood. She could feel the erratic, heavy thud of his heart against her knuckles. Harry turned his head slightly. Suddenly, his face was mere inches from hers. Clara froze. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. The storm raging outside seemed to fade into a dull hum. The air in the small kitchen grew heavy, thick with a sudden, overwhelming tension that neither of them could ignore. Harry's gaze dropped to her lips. His chest hitched. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he leaned forward, the gravity between them pulling him in. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to drown in the fierce, unbroken strength of the woman who had saved his life. For a fraction of a second, Clara's eyes fluttered shut. She leaned into the warmth radiating from him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It had been so long since a man had looked at her like this, not with pity, not with predatory greed like Silas Thorne, but with profound, consuming reverence. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of the rain hitting the tin roof snapped her back to reality. What am I doing? Clara's eyes flew open. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She was a widow with a child and a farm on the brink of ruin. She could not afford to be soft. She certainly could not afford to fall into the arms of a dangerous, secretive man who brought bullet holes and violence into her kitchen. She abruptly stood up, taking 3 rapid steps back, breaking the spell so violently that Harry flinched. "You're bound up," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it back into a mask of iron practicality. She threw a heavy wool blanket onto the chair beside him. "You can sleep by the fire tonight. Tomorrow, you finish the fence." Harry looked up at her, the longing in his eyes slowly retreating behind a wall of quiet understanding. He knew he had crossed a line, and he saw the terror in her eyes. Not terror of him, but of what she had almost let herself feel. He pulled the blanket over his battered shoulders. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," he said softly. Clara didn't reply. She turned and walked into the back room, closing the door firmly behind her. But as she leaned her back against the heavy wood, listening to the storm rage outside and the steady breathing of the billionaire disguised as a drifter in her kitchen, Clara knew one thing for certain. Her life, much like the burning piece of paper in the stove, would never be the same. The mud of the main street sucked at the wagon wheels with a thick, wet sound. The storm had passed, leaving the town of Oakhaven baking under a fresh, unforgiving sun that turned the flooded ruts into steaming trenches. Clara sat rigidly on the wagon bench, the reins held loosely in her gloved hands. Lily sat beside her, unusually quiet, while Harry walked alongside the draft horse. He wore a borrowed, faded canvas jacket of her late husband's that stretched too tight across his broad shoulders, concealing the fresh bandages beneath. Since the charged, breathless moment in the kitchen the night before, neither he nor Clara had spoken more than a handful of necessary words. The air between them felt like a drawn bowstring, humming with a tension that was entirely different from the threat of foreclosure. "Wait here," Clara instructed, pulling back on the reins in front of Higgins' Mercantile. "I'll only be a moment." Harry nodded, leaning his weight against the hitching post. He pulled his hat low, keeping his bruised face shadowed, but his pale eyes tracked her every movement. He watched Clara step onto the boardwalk, her chin held high, carrying a bundle of meticulously mended shirts. Inside the dim, cedar-smelling general store, Clara approached the counter. Mr. Higgins, a usually jovial man with a sprawling mustache, stopped sorting a box of nails and looked up. His face immediately fell. "Morning, Clara," Higgins muttered, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "Good morning, Arthur," Clara said smoothly, setting the bundle on the counter. "I brought the mending for the railroad crew. I was hoping to trade the labor against my ledger. We're in need of flour, coffee, and perhaps a small tin of those peaches Lily likes, if my credit extends that far." Higgins didn't touch the shirts. He looked out the front window, checking the street, before leaning in close. His voice was a strained whisper. "Clara, I can't." Clara's hand stilled on the counter. "Can't take the mending or can't extend the credit?" "Neither. Both." Higgins swallowed hard, looking genuinely pained. "Silas Thorne came by yesterday evening. He bought up the debt ledgers for half the storefronts in town, including mine. He left strict instructions. Nobody extends credit to the Vance farm. Nobody trades with you. If I give you so much as a cup of oats, he'll call in my loan and take my store." Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. It wasn't just the bank anymore. Silas was systematically cutting off her oxygen, starving her out before the 30 days were even up. "I see," Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, though her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She simply placed her hands on the bundle of shirts, pulled them back against her chest, and offered Higgins a sharp, polite nod. "Have a good day, Arthur." "Clara, I'm sorry." She didn't stay to hear it. Clara walked out the door, her spine iron straight. But as she hit the sunlight of the boardwalk, she stopped, gripping the wooden railing to steady herself. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, a silent, desperate prayer escaping her lips. From his spot by the wagon, Harry saw it all. He had watched through the glass. He had seen Higgins's cowardly refusal, and he had seen the devastating blow land on Clara's shoulders. He saw the way she fought to maintain her dignity in a town that was actively participating in her ruin. A cold, lethal fury ignited in Harry's chest. It was a rage entirely different from the kind he felt during boardroom hostile takeovers. This was personal. Silas Thorne was using the Sterling Bank's capital to build a petty tyranny, and he was crushing Clara Vance beneath his boot to do it. "Clara!" Harry stepped forward as she descended the stairs. "Don't," Clara snapped softly, her eyes flashing with unshed, furious tears she refused to let fall. "Just help Lily load the feed sacks we already paid for. I need to visit the farrier." She swept past him, needing a moment of solitude to rebuild her armor. Harry watched her go. Then he turned to Lily. "Load the wagon, Lily. I have an errand to run." Before the girl could question him, Harry strode down the boardwalk, his limp entirely vanishing, swallowed by his sheer, purposeful momentum. He didn't look like a battered drifter anymore. He walked with the precise, predatory stride of a man who owned the ground he stepped on. He pushed through the door of the Western Union Telegraph office. The operator, a scrawny young man with ink-stained fingers, barely looked up from his dime novel. "Ain't got no work for handouts, mister." Harry ignored him. He walked straight to the counter, grabbed a blank telegraph slip, and picked up a pen. He wrote quickly, his handwriting sharp and authoritative. He didn't write in English. He wrote in a specialized alphanumeric cipher used exclusively by the top executives of the Sterling Empire to communicate secure financial directives across the continent. Routing: Wall Street HQ, New York. Cipher: Omega 9 Sterling. Directive: freeze all operational capital, transfer authorizations, and ledger access for Wyoming branch manager S. Thorne. Effective immediately. Hold for in-person audit. A youth. HS the ghost walks. Harry slammed the paper onto the counter. Send this. Priority routing to New York. The operator scoffed, looking at Harry's ragged clothes. That's a cross-country wire, buddy. It costs $2. You look like you don't have 2 cents. Harry leaned across the counter. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer, crushing weight of his authority made the temperature in the room drop. He reached into his pocket and placed a solid silver button, torn from his ruined tailored vest, onto the wood. Send it collect to the recipient. Use the railroad executive override code 442, Harry commanded, his pale gray eyes pinning the operator to his chair. Do it now, or the men on the receiving end of that wire will ensure you never touch a telegraph key again for the rest of your natural life. The operator swallowed hard, intimidated by the terrifyingly cultured voice coming from the battered man. Trembling, he slid the silver button into his drawer and turned to his machine. Click, clack, click, clack. Harry waited until the final confirmation tap echoed in the small room. He turned and walked out, his jaw set in stone. Silas Thorne had just been cut off at the knees. But as the door swung shut, the operator stopped sweating. He looked down at his copy of the wire. He didn't know what the cipher meant, but he recognized the destination. Sterling Empire HQ. And he knew exactly who paid him a handsome side wage to report any unusual activity in town. The operator snatched his hat, locked the front door of the office, and sprinted down the back alley toward the bank. 10 minutes later, Silas Thorne was sitting behind his mahogany desk on the second floor of the bank, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He was smiling, enjoying the thought of Clara Vance finally breaking. The door burst open. The telegraph operator stumbled in, out of breath, and slapped the copied slip onto the desk. Thorne, you better look at this. That drifter staying out at the Vance place just marched in and sent a priority wire to New York. Used a high-level railroad override code. Silas frowned, annoyed by the intrusion. A drifter? Sending a wire to New York? He picked up the slip, his eyes scanning the alphanumeric jumble. For a few seconds, it was just gibberish. And then, Silas's blood ran completely cold. He had spent 2 years studying the internal memos of the Sterling Empire to figure out how to forge his way through their accounting blind spots. He didn't know the whole cipher, but he recognized the authorization sign-off, HS the Ghost Walks, S. The bourbon glass slipped from Silas's hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. What did this man look like? Silas demanded, his voice dropping to a panicked, breathless whisper. The drifter. Tell me exactly what he looked like. Tall. Beat to hell, the operator stammered, taking a step back. Got a bad bruise on his jaw and a pale, gray-eyed stare that makes you feel like you owe him money. Silas fell back into his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs. Gray eyes. 3 weeks ago, Silas had paid 5 heavily armed men to board a private rail car crossing the Nevada border. They were paid to put a bullet in Harrison Sterling's chest and dump his body in the desert, ensuring no one from New York ever came to audit the Wyoming branch. They had sworn the billionaire was dead. Silas looked down at the telegraph slip, his hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. Harrison Sterling wasn't dead. He was alive. He was sleeping in Clara Vance's barn, and he had just contacted New York. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Silas's chest. If Sterling's wire went through, the accounts would be frozen by morning. The marshals would be dispatched by noon. He would hang for embezzlement, forgery, and attempted murder, unless Harrison Sterling died tonight. For real this time. And anyone who had sheltered him died with him. Silas stood up, his fear instantly hardening into violent, desperate resolve. He walked to the window looking out over the town of Oakhaven, his eyes settling in the direction of the Vance farm. Go find Bates, Silas ordered the operator, his voice trembling with dark intent. Tell him to round up every gun we have on the payroll. We're riding out to the widow's place tonight. And tell them to bring the kerosene. The wagon ride back to the Vance farm was suffocatingly silent. The afternoon sun beat down on the parched earth, but the chill of Silas Thorne's embargo had settled deep into Clara's bones. Every closed door in Oakhaven had been a silent verdict: starve. As soon as they reached the farm, Clara didn't allow herself a moment to sit, to cry, or to panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She immediately marched into the house, swapped her town dress for a faded denim skirt and her husband's old leather work gloves, and grabbed a spool of barbed wire. "Lily!" Clara called out, her voice a tight, high wire of forced composure. "Get the copper pot boiling. Wash the bed linens and see what you can do with his clothes in that canvas bag. Use the lye soap. I'm going to ride the eastern fence line. I need to work." Lily, sensing the precarious edge her mother was balancing on, simply nodded. "Yes, Mama." Outside, Harry had already taken up the splitting maul. Despite the agony in his ribs, he drove the heavy iron head into the stacked firewood with punishing force. Thwack! Crack! He was trying to burn off the adrenaline of the telegraph office. He knew the wire to New York would set off an earthquake in the Sterling Empire. Silas Thorne's financial guillotine was already falling. Thorne just didn't know it yet. Harry figured Silas would receive notice from the regional bank by tomorrow morning, giving Harry just enough time to reveal his identity to Clara on his own terms and ensure she was protected. He had calculated the financial risks perfectly. What the billionaire failed to calculate was the desperate, murderous panic of a cornered man, and he completely failed to account for a 14-year-old girl with a washboard. Inside the stifling kitchen, Lily hauled a bucket of water from the pump and filled the copper-boiling pot. The air grew thick with steam and the sharp, caustic scent of lye. She scrubbed Harry's ruined, blood-stained shirt over the washboard until her knuckles ached. Then she turned her attention to the battered canvas bag he had carried with him on the day he collapsed. It was filthy, caked in Nevada desert mud and Wyoming dust. Lily picked it up by the straps to plunge it into the hot water. She paused. The bag was entirely empty. Harry had nothing but the clothes on his back. Yet the bottom of the canvas sack was oddly heavy. It listed to one side, pulling downward with a dense, concentrated weight. Lily frowned, turning the bag over in her hands. She ran her fingers along the reinforced leather bottom. It felt unnaturally stiff. Pressing her thumb against the seam, she felt the distinct, hard outline of something hidden between the layers of canvas and leather. A false bottom. Curiosity overrode her manners. She walked to her mother's sewing box, pulled out a sharp pair of iron shears, and carefully snipped the heavy waxed thread binding the bottom seam. As the stitches gave way, Lily reached her hand into the hidden pocket. Her fingers brushed against something wrapped in a layer of oiled silk. She pulled it out and set it on the scarred wooden kitchen table. With trembling fingers, she peeled back the oiled silk. A blinding flash of sunlight catching on solid, polished metal hit her eyes. Lily let out a soft gasp. It was a pocket watch, but not like any watch she had ever seen in Oakhaven. It was massive, forged of heavy 24-karat gold. The cover was intricately engraved with a sweeping, majestic crest. An eagle perched atop a steel railway wheel, flanked by laurel leaves. Attached to it was a thick gold chain that looked like it weighed more than the entire Vance cattle herd. Lily reached out and pressed the latch. The gold cover popped open with a crisp, expensive click. The face was flawless enamel, the hands delicate black steel, and it was running perfectly. Tick, 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 tick. The rhythmic metallic sound was startlingly loud in the quiet kitchen. But the watch wasn't the only thing in the oiled silk. Beneath it lay a thick, folded piece of heavy vellum parchment. The edges were warped and water-damaged, bearing the faint pink stains of washed-out blood, but the thick black ink in the center was pristine. Lily unfolded it carefully, smoothing the heavy paper flat against the table. It was a bank document. But it didn't look like the scary, cramped foreclosure notice Silas Thorne had nailed to their door. This paper had a massive watermark woven directly into the parchment. Lily traced the elegant, sweeping calligraphy with her finger, sounding out the words in a hushed whisper. Sterling Empire Banking Consortium. New York. Letter of credit. Unrestricted access. Bearer. Harrison Sterling. Authorized sum. $5 million. Lily's breath hitched in her throat. $5 million. It was a number so astronomically large her mind couldn't even process it. She looked from the paper to the solid gold watch and then toward the open window. Outside, the rhythmic thwack of the splitting maul continued. The battered, bleeding drifter who had slept on their floor and eaten their last scrap of food was swinging an axe in their yard. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of boots on the wooden planks of the front porch made Lily jump. The front door pushed open, and Clara stepped inside. She looked utterly exhausted. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat, and her leather work gloves were frayed from pulling barbed wire. She pulled the gloves off, dropping them onto a chair with a heavy sigh. "I managed to secure the eastern gap," Clara said, her voice hollow, not really looking at her daughter yet. "But if Silas sends his men back tonight, a wire fence isn't going to stop them. We need to start boarding the lower windows, Lily, just in case." When Lily didn't answer, Clara finally looked up. Lily was standing frozen by the kitchen table, her face as pale as fresh milk. "Lily, what is it? Did you burn yourself?" Clara rushed forward, her maternal instincts instantly flaring. Then Clara heard it. Tick, 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 tick. The sound was alien in their home. They didn't own a clock. They told time by the sun and the shadows. Clara's gaze dropped to the table. She saw the oiled silk. She saw the heavy, blindingly bright gold watch lying open on the scarred, flour-dusted wood. And then she saw the thick vellum paper. Clara stopped breathing. She reached out, her calloused, blistered fingers hovering over the document as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She read the bold, sweeping letters. Sterling Empire. $5 million. And the name, Harrison Sterling. The exact same name she had watched curl and burn in the ashes of her stove. The name of the phantom billionaire who owned the bank, who owned Silas Thorne, who owned the paper that was stripping away her home, her husband's legacy, and her daughter's future. Clara slowly lifted her eyes, staring out the window toward the woodpile. Harry paused mid-swing, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The muscles in his back rippled beneath the borrowed shirt. He turned his head, catching sight of Clara through the glass. He offered her a small, tight, genuine nod of respect. The puzzle pieces didn't just fall into place in Clara's mind. They slammed together with the bone-crushing force of a steel trap. The manicured fingernails, the refined vocabulary, the bullet graze from a professional assassin, the lethal, calculated way he had dismantled Bates without breaking a sweat. He wasn't a victim of the West. He was the apex predator of the East. "He is Harrison Sterling." Clara's hands began to shake. Not with fear. With a profound, devastating, earth-shattering betrayal. She had starved herself to feed him. She had bound his wounds. She had almost let herself fall into his arms, believing he was a broken man seeking redemption, when in reality, he was the king of the empire crushing her throat. Tick, 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 tick. The gold watch counted down the seconds in the silent room. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. The fragile, tentative warmth that had begun to thaw her frozen heart instantly crystallized back into solid, impenetrable ice. She turned on her heel, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. She marched straight past Lily, straight to the corner of the kitchen, and picked up her Winchester rifle. She pulled the lever down with a sharp, metallic clack, chambering a live round. "Mama," Lily whispered, terrified. "Stay inside," Clara commanded, her voice vibrating with a lethal, quiet rage. She kicked the back door open and stepped out onto the porch, raising the barrel of the rifle squarely at the broad chest of the billionaire in her yard. The sharp, metallic clack of the Winchester chambering a round cut through the humid afternoon air like a whip crack. Harry froze. He was mid-swing, the heavy iron maul raised above his shoulder. Slowly, he lowered the axe, letting the head rest against the chopping block. He turned toward the farmhouse, expecting to see Silas Thorne's riders returning for blood. Instead, he saw Clara. She stood on the edge of the back porch, the rifle pressed tight to her shoulder, her stance wide and perfectly balanced. The barrel was aimed dead center at his chest, but it was her face that made the breath lodge in Harry's throat. The stoic, unbreakable mask she had worn since the moment he met her was shattered. In its place was an expression of such profound, devastating betrayal that it hit him harder than the bullets on the train. "Clara?" Harry took a half-step forward, raising his hands, his palms still raw and bleeding. "What's wrong? Is it Thorne?" "Stop right there," Clara commanded. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried a lethal, hollow ring that stopped him dead in his tracks. "Do not take another step toward my house." The screen door creaked open behind her. Lily stepped out onto the porch, her small face pale and terrified. In her trembling hands she held the oilskin wrap. The blinding gold of the heavy pocket watch caught the harsh Wyoming sun, and fluttering in the breeze beneath it was the crisp, water-damaged vellum of the $5 million letter of credit. Harry's heart plummeted into his stomach. The ground seemed to drop out from beneath his boots. They found it. He lowered his hands slowly, the adrenaline draining from his veins, leaving only a cold, sickening dread. For a man who negotiated the purchase of entire rail lines without blinking, he suddenly found himself utterly stripped of words. "I wanted to believe you were a decent man who caught a bad break," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper that carried across the dusty yard. "I wanted to believe that the blood on your shirt and the bruises on your face meant you knew what it was like to survive out here. But it was all just a costume, wasn't it? Clara, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Clara finally broke, her voice cracking with the sheer, agonizing weight of her wounded pride. "Explain how you sat at my table, in my kitchen, and watched me break my last piece of cornbread in half for you. I starved myself that night so you wouldn't die in the dirt, and all the while you had the wealth of a nation sewn into your bag." Harry flinched as if she had struck him. "I didn't have a choice. When I collapsed at your gate, I didn't know who you were or who I could trust." "You knew exactly who I was." Clara cut him off, taking a step down the porch stairs, the rifle unwavering. "You saw the foreclosure notice burn in my stove. You saw your own name at the bottom of it. You watched me ride into town today, watched me swallow my pride and beg Arthur Higgins for a tin of flour, knowing full well that your bank, your empire, was the reason my daughter is going to bed hungry." "Thorne forged that notice," Harry yelled back, the desperation finally bleeding into his voice. He took a reckless step forward, ignoring the gun. "I didn't order the foreclosure on your farm, Clara. 3 weeks ago, Thorne paid 5 men to board my private rail car. They shot me, beat me, and threw me off a moving train into the Nevada desert to cover up the fact that he has been embezzling my capital to steal this valley." Clara's eyes narrowed, but the rifle didn't drop an inch. "So you admit it. You are Harrison Sterling." Harry stopped. He looked at the woman standing on the porch, her dress covered in dust, her hands calloused from barbed wire, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding dignity that all his millions could never buy. "Yes," Harry said softly. "I am." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the yard. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the gold watch in Lily's trembling hands. "I stayed hidden because I needed to gather proof of Thorne's treason before he realized I was alive and finished the job," Harry pleaded, his voice thick with raw regret. "But then I met you, and I saw what my company was doing to you. Clara, the money in that bag. I was going to use it to pay off the bank, to save this farm, to save you." It was the absolute worst thing he could have said. Clara's jaw tightened, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, searing fury. "Save me? You think I am some stray dog you can throw a gold coin at to ease your corporate conscience? You think your money buys away the fact that you lied to my face every single time you looked at me? That isn't true. Harry took another step, his heart pounding against his bruised ribs. The way I looked at you, what happened in the kitchen last night during the storm, that wasn't a lie, Clara. That was the most real thing I've felt in my entire life. It was a billionaire playing cowboy, Clara said coldly. She reached back, taking the letter of credit and the gold watch from Lily. With a swift, contemptuous motion, she threw them into the dirt at Harry's feet. The heavy gold case hit a rock, the glass face shattering, the ticking instantly stopping. I don't want your blood money, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, her voice turning to ice. I don't want your charity, and I don't want you on my land. Gather whatever dignity you have left and start walking. Harry stared at the shattered watch in the dirt. He looked back up at Clara. He could see the slight tremor in her arms holding the heavy rifle. He knew that if he pushed her now, if he tried to force his protection or his wealth upon her, he would destroy the only thing she had left, her pride. He had to leave. But he couldn't leave her to the wolves his own company had unleashed. Slowly, deliberately, Harry reached down and picked up the shattered watch and the crumpled letter of credit. He shoved them into his pocket. He didn't turn toward the barn to get his ruined jacket. He didn't have anything else to take. I will leave, Mrs. Vance, Harry said, his voice dropping to a low, solemn vow. The CEO was gone. The man who remained was stripped to his very soul. And I will never ask you to forgive my deceit. But I swear to you on my life, Silas Thorne will not take this farm. I am going to fix what I broke. Get off my property, Clara whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Harry gave her one last, lingering look, memorizing the fierce, beautiful defiance in her face. Then he turned on his heel. He didn't look back as he walked down the long, dusty drive. He limped slightly, his ribs aching, his blistered hands throbbing, walking weaponless into the fading Wyoming sunlight toward a town that wanted him dead. On the porch, Clara watched him until his broad shoulders disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she lower the Winchester. Her knees suddenly gave out, and she sank onto the top step of the porch, burying her face in her calloused hands. Lily immediately dropped down beside her, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother's trembling shoulders. Clara didn't sob, but a single bitter tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She had lost her husband to the harshness of the West. Today, she had lost her pride to a lie. But as the shadows lengthened across the yard, Clara gripped the barrel of the rifle once more. She would not lose her home. Billionaire or no billionaire, she would fight Silas Thorne to her last dying breath. The Wyoming night fell fast and hard, swallowing the heat of the day and replacing it with a biting, high-desert chill. Harrison Sterling walked. His boots were little more than shredded leather, his ribs ground together with every step, and his blistered hands throbbed in time with his racing heartbeat. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the hollow, aching void in his chest. He reached the crest of a low ridge about 3 miles from the Vance farm, and finally stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled the shattered heavy gold pocket watch from his pocket. The glass was gone, the delicate steel hands bent and frozen. It was useless now, just like his money had been when Clara looked at him with that devastating mixture of heartbreak and absolute disdain. A billionaire playing cowboy. Her words echoed in the dark, cutting deeper than the assassin's bullet ever had. Harry looked back over his shoulder toward the pitch-black valley. He couldn't see the farmhouse, but he could feel it. He could feel the exact spot where he had left his soul standing on a dusty porch. 5 miles away in the town of Oakhaven, another man was also looking out into the dark. But he wasn't feeling heartbreak. He was feeling the icy grip of the gallows tightening around his neck. Silas Thorne paced frantically behind his mahogany desk. The bank was locked, the shades drawn tight. Standing by the door was Bates, his neck heavily bruised from Harry's boot, looking sour and impatient. "The telegraph operator confirmed it, boss," Bates rasped, rubbing his throat. "New York wired back 20 minutes ago. The regional director is boarding a train tonight. The accounts are locked. We can't move a single red cent." Silas stopped pacing. His face, usually flushed with arrogance, was the color of spoiled milk. The game was over. The Empire had snapped the trap shut. "He's alive," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, unhinged pitch. "Harrison Sterling is walking around in the dirt of my town in a pair of rags." "Sterling?" Bates frowned, confusion fighting with anger. "The Railroad King? You told us he took a dirt nap in Nevada. You paid us extra to make sure of it." "You clearly didn't shoot him well enough, you incompetent fool," Silas roared, slamming his fist onto the desk. He took a wild, gasping breath, trying to steady his spiraling panic. If Sterling reached a U.S. Marshal, Silas wouldn't just lose the bank. He would hang in a federal penitentiary. "Dead men don't audit ledgers," Silas said, his eyes narrowing into dark, murderous slits. "And dead widows can't testify about forged foreclosure notices." Bates caught his meaning. The cowboy's hand dropped to the butt of his revolver. "You want us to wipe the Vance place?" "I want it erased from the map," Silas snarled, pulling a heavy Colt Peacemaker from his desk drawer and checking the cylinder. "Gather every man we have on the payroll. 10, 12 guns. Take the kerosene from the mercantile. I want that farmhouse burned to the foundation." "And Sterling?" "He was at the farm this afternoon. If the widow kicked him out, he's on foot and unarmed in the dark. If he's still there, burn him with her," Silas ordered, shoving the gun into his holster. "I don't care what it takes. Nobody breathes the morning air but us." Back on the ridge, Harry sat on a large boulder trying to figure out his next move. He needed to reach the county seat, find the federal authorities, and bring the full, crushing weight of his empire down on Thorne. But walking to the county line would take 2 days. He rubbed his face, the exhaustion finally threatening to pull him under. Then something caught his eye. Down in the valley, a spark of orange flickered in the blackness. Then another. And another. Harry stood up, his pale eyes narrowing as he tracked the movement. It was a line of torches, at least a dozen of them, moving out from the direction of Oakhaven. But they weren't heading up the main trail toward the county line, where a posse would search for a fleeing man. They were turning off the main road. They were cutting directly across the prairie, moving fast. They were heading straight for Clara's farm. The realization hit Harry with the force of a physical blow. Thorne wasn't coming for him. Thorne was going to slaughter Clara and Lily to bury the forged documents and draw Harry out into the open. Silas was going to burn the evidence, and he was going to burn the woman Harry loved along with it. "No," Harry breathed. He didn't have a horse, he didn't have a gun. He had cracked ribs, bleeding feet, and miles of treacherous, dark prairie between him and the farm. A rational man would have run the other way to find the law. A billionaire would have weighed the impossible odds of survival. Harry Sterling didn't even hesitate. He dropped the shattered gold watch into the dirt, leaving the last symbol of his immense wealth behind in the dust. He turned and broke into a dead sprint back toward the valley. Pain instantly flared in his chest, hot and blinding, but he forced it down. He let the sheer, desperate terror for Clara fuel him. He leaped over dry creek beds, tore through sharp sagebrush that ripped at his borrowed pants, and ignored the slick, hot feeling of blood soaking his boots. "Hold on, Clara. Just hold on." He kept his eyes fixed on the distant moving snake of torchlight. They had horses. They were moving much faster than he could run. But he knew the terrain now. He knew the shortcut through the eastern draw that Clara had shown him while patching the fence. He pushed his body past the point of human endurance. His lungs burned, tasting of copper. Every time his foot struck the hard earth, a shockwave of agony shot up his spine. But all he could see was Clara's face in the firelight of her kitchen. All he could feel was the phantom touch of her calloused hands binding his wounds. He had spent his entire life accumulating power, believing it made him invincible. Now, running unarmed through the dark to throw himself between a dozen hired killers and a stubborn widow, he finally understood what true power was. It was having something you were completely, unconditionally willing to die for. Up ahead, the silhouette of the Vance farmhouse suddenly became visible against the night sky. Not because of the moonlight, because the front porch had just caught fire. The sharp, terrifying crack, crack, crack of gunfire echoed across the valley, shattering the silence. Harry let out a guttural roar of absolute feral rage and sprinted toward the flames. The front window of the farmhouse exploded inward, sending a lethal shower of jagged glass across the braided rug. "Get down!" Clara screamed, shoving Lily roughly to the floor behind the heavy cast-iron cook stove. A second later, a volley of lead tore through the wooden siding of the house, splintering the walls and filling the suffocatingly hot kitchen with a cloud of plaster dust. Clara didn't flinch. She dropped to one knee, rested the barrel of her Winchester on the windowsill, and fired blindly into the dark. The lever-action clack-clack was deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, the crackle of burning wood grew louder. The flames on the front porch cast dancing, demonic shadows across the yard, illuminating the silhouettes of a dozen armed men using her corral and water trough for cover. "Clara!" Silas Thorne's voice carried over the roar of the fire, laced with a manic, desperate edge. "Throw out the forged notice and the property deed, and I'll let you and the girl walk away. Keep shooting, and you'll burn to ash right where you stand." Clara ground her teeth together, her eyes stinging from the thick, acrid smoke beginning to seep under the floorboards. She knew Silas was lying. He couldn't leave witnesses. He had come to erase them. She ejected a spent shell casing, the hot brass burning her arm as it fell, and aimed at a shadow darting toward the porch. She pulled the trigger. The shadow collapsed with a scream. "I have 8 rounds left," Clara whispered to herself, the terrifying arithmetic of survival settling over her. Out in the darkness, beyond the ring of firelight, Harry hit the dirt. His lungs were burning, his muscles pushed far beyond their breaking point. But the sight of the flames licking up the wooden pillars of Clara's porch sent a fresh surge of lethal adrenaline through his veins. He was unarmed, but he was no longer the vulnerable drifter who had collapsed at her gate. He was a man who knew exactly what he stood to lose. Harry crept around the perimeter of the light, circling toward the rear of the cabin. The back door was in the shadows. Standing guard beside it was one of Silas's hired guns, a heavy-set man holding a lit kerosene torch in one hand and a drawn revolver in the other, waiting for the smoke to flush Clara out. Harry didn't hesitate. He moved with terrifying, silent speed. He lunged from the darkness, wrapping his forearm around the guard's throat and driving his knee sharply into the man's lower spine. The guard choked, dropping the torch into the mud. Before the man could raise his gun, Harry twisted his wrist with a brutal, sickening snap, catching the heavy Remington revolver as it fell from the guard's paralyzed fingers. Harry delivered a final, calculated strike to the base of the man's skull, dropping him unconscious into the dirt. Harry picked up the torch, extinguished it in the mud, and checked the cylinder of the stolen Remington. 6 rounds. He pressed his back against the siding next to the locked back door. "Clara!" Harry roared over the deafening crackle of the fire. "It's Harry! I'm coming through the back!" Inside the smoke-filled kitchen, Clara froze. "Harry!" Her heart slammed against her ribs. She spun around, leveling the Winchester at the heavy oak door just as it burst open. Harry dove inside, hitting the floor and rolling hard as a bullet from the front yard tore through the space where his head had just been. He kicked the door shut behind him, breathing heavily, his face streaked with soot, sweat, and blood. Clara stared at him through the haze of gunsmoke. "I told you to leave." "I've never been good at taking orders," Harry coughed, crawling over to her position by the window. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes completely stripped of any billionaire pretense. They were wild, desperate, and entirely focused on her. "Are you hurt? Where is Lily?" "I'm here," Lily called out, coughing into a rag from behind the stove. "The roof is catching," Clara said, her voice tight with suppressed panic as a burning ember dropped from the ceiling into the sink. "We can't hold them off. We don't have the ammunition." "We don't need to kill them," Harry said, his mind shifting into the ruthless tactical overdrive that had built his empire. "We just need to outlast them until the law arrives. The U.S. Marshals are stationed in the county seat." "That's a 10-mile ride." Clara fired another shot out the window, forcing a cowboy behind the water trough to duck. "And all 3 of our horses are locked in the barn. They've got us pinned." Harry looked toward the small pantry window at the back of the house. It faced the corral, entirely shielded from Silas's men at the front. "Not all of us," Harry said. He looked at the 14-year-old girl. "Lily, you're the lightest. Can you ride bareback?" Lily's eyes widened, but she saw the absolute terrifying trust in Harry's gaze. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir." "No." Clara grabbed Harry's arm, her fingers digging fiercely into his torn shirt. "I will not send my daughter out there into the dark with those killers." "Clara, look at me." Harry grabbed her shoulders, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He forced her to look into his eyes. "If we stay in this house, we all burn. I will not let you die. I will not let her die. We are going to draw every ounce of their fire to the front porch." Lily slips out the pantry window, takes the roan gelding, and rides the creek bed out of the valley. They won't even see her. Clara looked at the flames eating through the ceiling boards. She looked at Harry, seeing the man who had run miles through the dark, unarmed, just to stand beside her in a burning house. The anger and betrayal from the afternoon evaporated in the intense heat of the fire, leaving only absolute trust. "Okay," Clara breathed. She turned to Lily, pressing a quick, fierce kiss to her daughter's soot-stained forehead. "Ride like the devil is on your heels, Lily. Do not stop until you see a silver star." "I won't, Mama," Lily promised, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "Go," Harry ordered. Lily scrambled into the pantry and shinnied out the small window, disappearing into the smoky darkness toward the barn. "All right, Mr. Sterling." Clara racked the lever of her Winchester, her eyes burning with lethal determination. "Let's give them hell." "Gladly, Mrs. Vance." Harry and Clara stood up on opposite sides of the front window. They didn't need to coordinate. They moved as a single, devastating unit. Clara fired with terrifying, methodical precision, her rifle cracking again and again, pinning Silas's men behind the corral fencing. Harry covered the flanks, leaning out the shattered window to unleash a hail of covering fire from the heavy Remington, picking off 2 men trying to flank the porch. "They're shooting back! Rush the door!" Silas screamed from the dark, losing his grip on the situation. Bullets chewed through the walls, shattering plates and tearing through the kitchen table. Harry grabbed Clara by the waist, pulling her down to the floor just as a slug ripped through the space where she had been standing. He kept his body positioned over hers, shielding her from the falling debris and showering sparks. Clara looked up at him, her chest heaving against his. "She's out," Clara whispered, hearing the distant muffled thud of hooves hitting the soft dirt of the creek bed. "Lily made it." Harry let out a breathless laugh, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, chaotic second. "Good girl." A massive piece of the burning porch roof suddenly collapsed, blocking the front door in a wall of roaring flame. The heat inside the cabin became unbearable, sucking the oxygen from their lungs. Harry checked the cylinder of his stolen revolver. Click. Empty. He looked at Clara. She held up her Winchester. The action was locked open. She was completely out of ammunition. Outside, the gunfire slowly died down as Silas Thorne realized the return fire had ceased. "They're out of powder!" Silas's triumphant, vicious laugh echoed through the smoke. "Burn it down! Burn it to the ground!" The flames crawled up the interior walls, turning the small farmhouse into a glowing, inescapable cage. Harry pulled Clara tightly to his chest, wrapping his arms around her as the smoke thickened, bracing for the inevitable collapse of the roof. They had bought Lily the time she needed, but their own time had just run out. The roar of the fire was no longer just a sound. It was a living, breathing monster consuming the oxygen in the room. The heat blistered the paint on the cupboards and turned the cast-iron stove into a glowing radiator. Harry held Clara tightly against the floorboards, his body shielding hers from the showering sparks as the ceiling groaned in agony. Her hands were fisted in his ruined, blood-stained shirt. She was coughing violently, her lungs screaming for clean air. "Clara," Harry rasped, his voice barely audible over the inferno. He pressed his forehead against hers, his pale gray eyes locked onto her dark ones. He didn't offer empty promises of survival. He simply wanted his face to be the last thing she saw. "I love you. God help me, I love you." Clara's eyes widened, the fierce, independent widow momentarily stripped bare by the raw, unvarnished truth in his voice. She reached up, her soot-stained hand cupping his bruised jaw. Before she could speak, the night outside exploded. It wasn't the scattered, chaotic popping of Silas Thorne's hired guns. It was the synchronized, thunderous boom of heavy-caliber rifles firing in perfect discipline. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons and step into the light," a voice boomed, cutting through the crackle of the flames with absolute, undeniable authority. Harry and Clara froze. Outside, the arrogant shouts of Silas's men instantly turned into panicked screams. There was the frantic whinnying of horses, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the dirt, and the sharp metallic ratcheting of shotguns being cocked by men who wore silver stars. "They're here!" Harry gasped, a wild surge of adrenaline flooding his exhausted veins. He hauled himself to his feet, pulling Clara up with him. "We have to move, now!" The front door was a wall of solid flame. Harry wrapped his arm around Clara's waist, practically carrying her as he threw his entire weight against the jammed back door. The wood splintered, giving way, and they spilled out into the cool, life-saving Wyoming night air, collapsing into the mud of the backyard. Clara took a desperate, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the sweet scent of damp earth and sagebrush. "Mama! Mama!" Clara looked up through the stinging smoke. Lily was sprinting across the yard, her face streaked with soot and tears. She threw herself into her mother's arms, nearly knocking Clara back into the mud. Clara buried her face in her daughter's hair, sobbing in pure, unadulterated relief. Harry rolled onto his back, staring up at the smoke-filled sky, his chest heaving. The front yard of the Vance farm was a chaotic tableau of swift, brutal justice. A dozen men in long canvas dusters were swarming the property. Silas Thorne's hired guns were on their knees in the dirt, their hands bound tightly behind their backs. And in the center of it all, pinned to the ground by a massive U.S. Marshal, was Silas Thorne himself. His tailored East Coast suit was covered in mud and horse manure, his bowler hat crushed beneath a deputy's boot. The lead marshal, a grizzled man with a thick silver mustache, walked around the side of the burning house. He took one look at Harry, then at the women, and signaled for his men to start a bucket line from the water trough to save what was left of the farmhouse structure. Harry slowly pushed himself up. His legs trembled, his ribs ached with a blinding intensity, and his hands were a ruined, bloody mess. But as he walked toward the front yard, the battered drifter vanished. The posture, the cold stare, the sheer, crushing aura of Harrison Sterling returned. Silas Thorne, struggling against his cuffs, looked up. When his eyes met Harry's, the blood drained completely from his face. He stopped fighting. He looked at the billionaire he had tried to murder, realizing with absolute certainty that his life was over. Harry didn't say a word to Silas. He didn't need to. The look of absolute corporate execution in his pale gray eyes promised that Silas would spend the rest of his miserable life breaking rocks in a federal penitentiary. Harry turned his back on the ruined bank manager and walked over to Clara. She was standing near the porch, which had collapsed into a smoldering heap of charred timber. She looked exhausted, her dress torn, her face smeared with ash, but her spine was as straight as ever. Harry stopped in front of her. The adrenaline finally abandoned him, leaving only the crushing weight of his injuries and the overwhelming magnitude of what she had done for him. Slowly, painfully, Harrison Sterling, a man who dictated terms to presidents and kings, dropped to his knees in the Wyoming dirt. He looked up at Clara, completely surrendering his pride, his wealth, and his ego at her boots. "You didn't have to stay," Harry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have bargained with him. You could have handed me over. But you fought for me." Clara looked down at the man kneeling in the mud. The anger that had consumed her that afternoon was gone, burned away by the fire and the stark reality of the lengths he had gone to protect her daughter. "You ran back into a burning house for us, Harry," Clara said softly, her voice carrying over the hiss of the dying flames. "I reckon that makes us even." The lead marshal walked over, holding a thick leather portfolio he had pulled from Silas Thorne's saddlebags. He tipped his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Vance, your girl here rode a bareback horse 10 miles in the pitch dark to find us. You raised a hell of a woman." The marshal looked down at Harry, offering a hand to pull the billionaire to his feet. "Mr. Sterling, your telegraph from Oakhaven set off alarms all the way to Washington. The regional director is already seizing Thorne's assets." Harry winced as he stood, clutching his ribs, but he nodded. "Make sure Thorne is held without bail, Marshal. I'll have a fleet of corporate lawyers here by Tuesday to formally press the embezzlement and attempted murder charges." "Consider it done," the marshal said. He turned to Clara, opening the leather portfolio. Inside was the master ledger of Silas's crimes, including the forged deed to the Vance farm. He pulled the heavy vellum document out and handed it to Clara. "Mrs. Vance, with Thorne going away, the bank's local holdings will be tied up in federal court for years. Given what this man put you through, you have every right to press for massive financial damages. You could take the bank for a small fortune to rebuild this place." Clara looked at the forged deed in her hands. The thick black ink, the fake signature, the official seal that had caused her so many sleepless, terrified nights. She looked at Silas Thorne, who was being hauled to his feet by 2 deputies, watching her with pathetic, wide-eyed terror. Clara's jaw set. She didn't want a small fortune. She didn't want Sterling Bank's money. She wanted her dignity. With a swift, decisive motion, Clara ripped the heavy vellum deed right down the middle. She put the pieces together and tore them again and again, until the document that had threatened to destroy her family was nothing but a handful of confetti. She opened her hands, letting the harsh night wind catch the pieces and scatter them into the smoldering ash of her ruined porch. "No money," Clara said, her voice ringing out clear and hard across the quiet yard. She looked dead into Silas Thorne's panicked eyes. "I don't want a dime from a coward. I want him in a chain gang. And I want him spending the next 20 years swinging a hammer, rebuilding every single fence in this valley he ever tore down." A low chuckle escaped the marshal's lips. "I think a federal judge will find that highly appropriate, ma'am." As the deputies dragged a sobbing Silas Thorne toward the prisoner transport wagons, Harry stepped closer to Clara. The chaotic noise of the yard seemed to fade, leaving only the 2 of them standing in the smoke and the breaking light of dawn. "Clara," Harry said, his voice hesitant, vulnerable, "I have to take the morning train to New York. I have to testify, and I have to dismantle the rot in my company, so this never happens to another family again." He reached out, his bloody, bruised fingers gently brushing a stray lock of soot-stained hair from her cheek. He didn't ask her to wait for him. He knew he hadn't earned the right. "But when it's done," Harry swallowed hard, his pale eyes searching hers, "when I've fixed what I broke, would you let a drifter come back and finish fixing that western fence?" Clara looked at the billionaire who had bled for her. Her heart ached with a sudden, fierce longing, but she kept her chin high. "The posts are still rotted, Harry," Clara whispered, a faint, genuine ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I suppose someone's going to have to dig them out." Harry closed his eyes, a profound, shuddering breath of relief escaping him. He stepped back, joining the marshals as they mounted up. Clara stood with Lily, the morning sun cresting over the Wyoming ridge, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of gold and bruised purple. She watched Harris and Sterling ride away, knowing with absolute certainty that the fire hadn't destroyed her home. It had only cleared the ground for something new to be built. September brought a crisp, forgiving edge to the Wyoming air, sweeping away the suffocating heat of the summer. At the Vance farm, the charred, blackened timbers of the front porch had been cleared away. In their place sat neat stacks of freshly milled pine, waiting to be built into something stronger than what had stood there before. Clara stood in the yard, wiping her brow with the back of her leather work glove. It had been exactly 34 days since Harrison Sterling rode out of her valley. In that time, the world had shifted on its axis. A thick, wax-sealed envelope had arrived via federal courier 2 weeks prior. It contained a deed of absolute unencumbered ownership for her land, formally clearing the forged debt. Accompanying it was a clipping from a Cheyenne newspaper detailing the swift, brutal dismantling of Silas Thorne's operation. Thorne had been sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in a federal penitentiary, his assets seized and liquidated to compensate the families he had wronged. Clara had read the letter, placed it safely in her late husband's tin box, and gone right back to mending her fences. She was safe. Her daughter was safe. The farm was hers. Yet, as she looked out over the vast golden expanse of the prairie, an undeniable heavy ache settled deep in her chest. She missed the quiet, bruised drifter who had swung a maul in her yard. She missed the intense, pale gray eyes that had looked at her not as a fragile widow, but as an equal. She missed Harry. "Mama." Lily's voice rang out from the chicken coop, bright and urgent. Clara turned, her hand instinctively dropping toward the holster at her hip, a habit that would take a long time to break. But Lily wasn't pointing at danger. She was pointing down the long, dusty wagon trail leading from Oakhaven. Approaching the farm was not a buckboard wagon or a lone rider. It was a sleek, impeccably polished Concord coach, gleaming with black enamel and gold pinstriping, drawn by 4 magnificent, perfectly matched bay horses. It was a carriage built for kings, moving smoothly over the rutted Wyoming dirt, as if it owned the earth beneath it. Clara's breath hitched. Her heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She pulled off her work gloves, her hands trembling slightly, and stepped forward as the carriage pulled to a graceful halt near the barn. The heavy door swung open. Harrison Sterling stepped out. He took Clara's breath away. The soot, the blood, and the ragged canvas were gone. In their place was a man of staggering, terrifying wealth. He wore a masterfully tailored charcoal gray 3-piece suit, a crisp white collar, and a silk tie. His jaw was clean-shaven, the deep purple bruises fully healed, leaving only the faint, rugged shadow of the scar along his collarbone, hidden beneath the fine wool. He looked every inch the ruthless, untouchable billionaire who commanded the eastern seaboard. Clara stopped 10 feet away. Suddenly, the chasm between them felt wider than the entire continent. How could a man like that ever belong in the dust of a cattle ranch? Harry looked at her. He saw the hesitation in her dark eyes, saw the way she guarded her heart. A slow, brilliant smile broke across his face. Without breaking eye contact, Harry reached up and unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, and without a second glance, tossed the unimaginably expensive garment through the open door of the carriage. He pulled off the silk tie and threw it after the coat. He unbuttoned the wool vest and discarded it onto the leather seat. Beneath the armor of the billionaire, Harry was wearing a faded, incredibly soft-looking red flannel shirt. He reached down and unlaced the pristine leather dress shoes, kicking them into the dirt, and pulled a pair of scuffed, heavy-duty leather work boots from the carriage floorboard, stamping his feet into them. He rolled the sleeves of the flannel shirt up past his elbows. His forearms were thick with corded muscle, and when he flexed his hands, Clara saw the thick, permanent calluses that had formed from the hours he had spent swinging an axe in her yard. Harry didn't walk toward the front door to be received as a guest. He walked straight past the carriage, his boots crunching in the dirt, and headed directly for the Western Corral. He stopped at the exact fence post he had been working on the day Silas Thorne's men had ridden onto the property. He reached out, gripping the wooden rail, and gave it a hard shake. It wobbled loosely in the dry earth. Harry turned his head, his pale gray eyes locking onto Clara, who was watching him in stunned, breathless silence. Lily stood a few yards away, a massive, knowing grin spreading across her face, before she quietly slipped into the barn to give them privacy. Harry picked up a heavy iron maul leaning against the trough. He rested the handle against the earth and looked across the yard at the woman who had saved his life. "I can run a financial empire from a telegraph office in Oakhaven, Clara," Harry called out, his low, gravelly voice carrying perfectly on the crisp autumn wind. "I can buy railroads and negotiate steel contracts from a desk. But this western fence," he patted the loose wooden post, "this fence needs a steady hand." Clara took a step forward, a sudden, blinding warmth flooding her chest, melting away the last remnants of the ice that had guarded her heart for so long. Harry let go of the maul and took a few slow, deliberate steps toward her, stopping just inches away. He reached out, his calloused, capable fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Do you happen to have any cornbread left, Mrs. Vance?" Harry whispered, his eyes shining with absolute, unwavering devotion. "For a man who wants to stay forever?" Clara looked up at the billionaire who had stripped away his entire world just to stand in hers. The pride that had been her shield was no longer necessary. She didn't need to protect herself from a man who treated her heart as his most prized possession. "The flour barrel is full, Mr. Sterling," Clara whispered, a radiant, tearful smile breaking across her face. "And I reckon the fence isn't going to fix itself." Harry let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and lifted her off the ground. Clara threw her arms around his neck, burying her hands in his hair, and pulled him down into a fierce, passionate kiss. It was a kiss that tasted of wind, of survival, and of a promise forged in the fires of the West. It was the collision of two unbreakable souls who had finally found their safe harbor. Above them, the vast, endless Wyoming sky stretched out, bright, clear, and perfectly blue, watching over a billionaire in a flannel shirt, and the fiercely proud widow who had finally let him come home.